today we say a very warm welcome to Paula Hawkins, the author of The Girl on a Train and the recent novel A Slow Fire Burning. So welcome, Paula Hawkins, to Romania.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
My first question is about the moment you decide to write A Slow Fire Burning. I read that you were walking along a London canal and a certain idea popped up. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes, that's true. I was this was sort of around 2018, and I was thinking about what to write for my next book. And my flat in London is quite near the Regent's Canal, so I was spending quite a lot of time walking around there. And I don't know if anyone knows it, but this part of the canal in Islington, there's lots of little houseboats there. People live down there. And most of these houseboats are really pretty and nicely kept, and they've got little pot plants and bicycles and things. But sometimes you see one that looks very dirty and the windows are filthy and it's kind of sinking into the water. And I did start thinking about, what might be inside one of those boats. There could be anything in there and you would just not know. There could be like a body in there and you wouldn't know. So that's sort of where I started thinking that would be a great location to start a crime novel, for someone to find something inside one of those boats. And that's kind of where the story got started.
Great. A Slow Fire Burning, it's a thriller, but also offers a very interesting perspective on the baggage we carry with us from past traumas. It's not easy to write about trauma. And you did a wonderful job, but I wonder, was it hard to go there in the trauma territory?
Yes, certainly. Some of the storylines are quite painful to write about, to try and imagine yourself in that kind of situation and what you might be feeling. So all of the characters in this book have suffered something in their past, and some things are more terrible than others. One character, Laura, has had an accident which has left her with some issues, but some of the other characters have suffered violence or a terrible tragic loss, and so it's hard to imagine yourself. But I find that very interesting, to imagine myself in those situations, to imagine how you might try to recover from something terrible happening to you. What would it do to your personality? What kind of person might you be if you suffered something like that? And obviously different people react in different ways. There's no sort of no handbook for this kind of thing. But I find those kind of questions quite interesting, and to think about how you would develop and how your relationships might be. But yes, it's certainly, Carla, for example, is one of the characters. She's the aunt of a man who's found murdered at the beginning of the novel. And she suffered a terrible thing, and there were parts of it. It's very difficult to write about her life after what's happened to her. Yeah.
In this respect, is the writing cathartic or maybe healing for you in some ways?
I think it is. I think that there are certainly ways in which one can explore things, concerns or anxieties perhaps that one's had, and figure them out to some degree. I'm not sure, because I'm not sure I ever come to any great revelations or find any answers, but it is in some way helpful to think about these things, to explore them to some degree. But yes, I'm not saying that I come up with answers that might necessarily be helpful to people, but for me personally, I enjoy thinking about those things. Enjoy sounds like a weird word, but that I do think it is useful to think about some of those things and to write them down and to imagine how the story might play out, and to give yourself sort of an ending, at least, even if not an answer.
You start your novels with the character, right? In A Slow Fire Burning, we have Laura Kilbride, which I think it's maybe the main character.
Yeah.
How and why did you choose a character with so much pain in the past, in her life and in the present. It's a very interesting choice.
Yeah, I was thinking about this character for a while. I'd heard a story that a friend of mine told me about someone they knew whose daughter had had an accident, and then had suffered some problems, some personality changes afterwards. So this was kind of the start of the idea, and I was thinking that this was interesting to have them to write about somebody who. So Laura's knocked off her bike when she's a child, and now she has a condition. She had a brain injury, and she has a condition called disinhibition, which means that she says and does inappropriate things. She doesn't behave perhaps as she ought to, and she loses her temper, and she's forgetful, and she finds it hard to maintain a job, to maintain relationships. That to me is a very interesting person to write about. Somebody who's essentially a good person. She's not a bad person, she's good, but she struggles to do what she's supposed to. Life is much harder for her in lots of ways. But she's also good, she's generous, she's kind, she's vulnerable because of her character, of her problems. So that's such a fascinating character to me. There's so much scope there for you to think about how she would react in certain situations, how she might get herself into trouble without meaning to, all those kind of things. That for me is a very sort of character that I want to write about, and I want to follow around. In a way, she has some similarities with Rachel from The Girl on the Train, because who also had all these problems. You know, she created her own problems, Rachel, because of her drinking. But again, not a bad person, essentially a good person, but someone who finds it more difficult to sort of navigate her way through life than maybe others do. And for me, I'm very interested in those sorts of people.
You just guessed my next question, which is about Rachel and Laura, because Rachel had suffered from alcoholism, and Laura has a mental disorder. Do you document these traits, these vulnerabilities, reading, I don't know, medical studies or psychology?
I've certainly read a lot about, yes, alcoholism. I've read a lot about the condition of disinhibition, not in probably medical papers, but just sort of, in newspapers, in articles about how people might behave. Obviously, alcoholism is quite a common problem in our society. So I have experience of seeing people who've suffered with addiction problems, who've struggled to get themselves back on the straight and narrow. So they are the sorts of things that you can research, but to some degree you can also imagine yourself. You can imagine the sorts of problems that might arise. With Rachel, there was a very specific issue she had, which was that she didn't remember things, and that was actually central to kind of the plot of the novel. And that was something I'd also read about, not only in the case of alcoholism, but there are other things that can make you forget or make you lose your memory. So I was always very interested in that aspect of it, specifically with the memory loss. With Laura, it's more the loss of control and the fact that she cannot, for example, when she's being interrogated by the police, she says things that she really shouldn't say. She's too honest. She has no filter, that everything comes out. So she finds it hard to protect herself. So those are the kinds of things I find fascinating and are very useful in a crime novel, because you can see how somebody in those situations could get into more and more trouble without meaning to.
As Slow Fire Burning, it's also about revenge, an important motive in the novel. And my question is, how do you blend themes for your novels? We have trauma, we have revenge, we have motherhood, parenthood, and we have nation, we have vulnerable persons, we have loneliness. How do you mix them together?
Well, I think really the theme comes out of character, because so I think about the characters and I think about the stories that I want to tell with them, and I think about what they've gone through. And so the thematic element of it sort of tends to come out of that quite naturally. You're writing about somebody, so for example, who suffered a loss in their family, and you then start to think about what their, you know, their parenting style, what they were like as a parent, what they did wrong, what they did right, and you might think about somebody who's had a wrong done to them, who feels that society has been, you know, or they have been judged in some way, and who wants to seek revenge for that. So it tends, those themes tend to come out of the stories that I'm telling, and then once you've sort of realized, it's almost a strange thing. You kind of write it, and then you realize what you're writing about, and then you can reinforce those themes and make sure that that the character arcs are satisfying, and that you explore those questions in a satisfying way. But then it's not the case that I sort of think at the beginning, I want to write about revenge. I wanted to write about a character, but she happens to be a vengeful character. So
yeah, they add up.
Yeah.
In this novel, we have a male novelist character writing crime fiction under a female pen name. I liked it, but how did you come up with this character?
Yeah, so this is the character of Theo, who is, yes, a novelist. He wrote a sort of a literary book which is very successful, and then he had a writer's block, and so he decided to write a crime novel to try and help himself get over his writer's block. And yeah, he's quite a fun character for me to write. Some of his experiences are experiences that I've had. Some of them are not, and I was kind of, to some degree, having a bit of fun with the way that some literary writers talk about genre fiction, you know, that it's not very important and it's not valuable and what have you. So I was playing around with that a bit. There is also an element to which Theo's story and the book that Theo writes, the crime novel, is important for the plot, because as we discover that the idea he has for his novel is not entirely his own. He's kind of taken something from someone else, and that was very interesting to me, because I was thinking a lot about the way that writers take ideas from all over the place. I take ideas from, as I said, you know, somebody told me a story and I think, oh, that's interesting. And we accept that. But there's a line, isn't there, that you shouldn't cross, where you shouldn't take somebody else's work, for example, or you shouldn't use them in a way that feels exploitative. So there were lots of different elements that I was able to play with in that, and I really enjoyed doing that. To write about a writer is quite fun for a writer to do.
You have mostly female characters in your novels. Is it a deliberate choice? I know, being a woman, it's easier to write about women.
Yeah.
Sometimes, but how do you feel about male characters?
Yeah, it's not something that I sort of think about a great deal in advance. I just tend to, the people I tend to want to write about always seem to be women. In fact, I think in my next novel I may have a male protagonist, but it's not something that I think, oh, I don't want to write about men. It's just, when I come up with an idea, they're often about women's lives and women's problems and women's place in society. I think those are the things that are just at the forefront of my mind. So I'm more drawn to those kinds of characters. There's so much about being a woman and a woman's life, and the ways in which society judges women, and the things that society asks of women, that I find really interesting, and how women who don't necessarily fit into those societal structures, or women who reject them, what their lives are like. And I just happen to be quite interested in those kind of questions. So it's very natural for me to write about women. But that's not to say that I would never write about men. And as I say, I think I will possibly have a central character in my next novel that's a man. And not a bad one, but a good one for a change, because most of the men tend to be quite, I mean, Theo's not a bad person, but he's not a great person either. But yeah, so it's just something that naturally comes to me. Yeah.
Some others plan before they start a new novel. Others, they just start and wait to see where the story goes. How about you? What is your modus operandi?
It's not the same for every single book, but I tend to be sort of in the middle, because I don't like to plan out every single little bit of the plot, but I also don't like to not know what end point I'm aiming for. So I like to know sort of if there's been when there's been a murder, I like to know who done it and why. But then a lot of the detail of the novel I will figure out while I'm writing it, and I think that's more fun. I think it makes the writing better. It's less mechanical. It's not so boring from my point of view. So, and I think if it's boring for a writer, it's going to be boring for a reader. So, it's much more enjoyable to me to leave lots of things undecided. However, I'm not one of those people who can just not know what the ending is, because I would be very worried that I wouldn't have an ending. So I'm kind of in the middle, but it's different for different books. And I think, for example, the book I'm thinking about writing next, I have a clearer idea of what's going to happen. But that may change. That may change. We'll see.
Change is good. Have you ever had the impulse to rewrite a novel or a chapter or a scene after you send it to the publisher?
Well, I think I don't really like to reread things, because I will start thinking, oh, I shouldn't have done that. You know, I should have done this differently. I should have done that differently. It's why I don't really like to look at the novels again once I'm done with them. Certainly, I've had the feeling sometimes that I would like to return to a character, not Rachel, not a main character, but maybe one of the smaller characters. From Into the Water, for example, there were lots of characters, and there were some minor ones, and I think, oh, it might be quite interesting to think about what happened to them afterwards, or you know, what happened in their life. So I do that, but yeah, I don't like to look at books again, because I think you start to see all the things that you wish you'd done differently.
Yeah. Have you ever considered the idea of writing a series instead of standalone novels?
Well, there's a couple of issues. You need to find a character that you really want to stay with for a very long time. So that's important. But the other thing is that for me, the most interesting part of the whole story of a crime is not the detection and the forensics and the police procedure that happens afterwards. I'm much more interested in all the psychological stuff that happens before, that, you know, the feelings of all the characters, the perpetrator, the victims, everybody else involved. But if you're going to write a series, you kind of need to have a detective, or, you know, you need that. So for me, it would be quite, I'd have to figure out exactly the right kind of character that I'm going to follow. So I have never been able to do that. But I wouldn't rule it out.
I read that you split your time between London and Edinburgh, and you have Scottish ancestors.
I do. I'm in Edinburgh now, actually. I don't know the precise. I'm not very good on family trees, but I definitely do on both sides of my family. I think that the family came from Scotland somewhere. They've got the Scottish names in there and that kind of thing. But I'm very bad at genealogy, so I mean, I should ask my parents.
So maybe the setting for a next novel can be somewhere in Scotland.
It's possible, yes. Not giving anything away yet, but maybe.
Yeah. And my last question: how was this difficult period for you, the pandemic? I don't know, for a writer, maybe could have been more creative, or I don't know.
I was very lucky. I didn't get ill, and I didn't lose anyone close to me. And because I work from home anyway, I was in the middle of writing my novel. So compared to most people, I had a very easy time. Also, I don't have small children. I don't have any children, so I didn't have to worry about schooling or any of those things. So compared to most people, I had a very easy time of it. So obviously, I don't want to go back to it, but it wasn't too bad for me. It was fine. I mean, I'm glad now that things are opening up and we can travel again, because that's important for me from a sort of creative point of view, to get out there and to see people and meet people and go to art galleries or what have you. But it was easier for me than I think it was for most people. Yeah.
Thank you. So after this first meeting with your Romanian readers, online. Maybe we will have a live meeting when all things will go back to
Yes.
normal, and you will be able to have book tours and include Romania in one of
I
them.
would really love that. I actually visited Bucharest in the 1990s. When I was a journalist, I used to write for a magazine that wrote about Central Europe. And so I came to Bucharest and I really liked it. I was only there for like a few days, but I would love to come back to Romania. And I've heard that the countryside is really beautiful. So I would love to do that. Hopefully, maybe next year.
Yeah, if you liked Bucharest when he was very ugly and in a bad time, you will love it these days.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you
Okay.
so much. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, and consider it an invitation.
Thank you so much.
We
Great to
want
talk to you.
to have you in Romania.
Thank you.
Thank you.